Creating a story is a fight. It's been almost 7 years since I first picked up a camera, and since then, it's really been a huge learning process of trial and error. I went from not even knowing how to expose my image to being nervous about my worth towards clients. In doing so, I realized how much of art is actually just a process of learning and an evolution of ideas as we develop our vision through our respective mediums. So today, I just wanted to share some of the thoughts that I've reflected on about that and walk you through why everything you do before a shoot can make or break what comes after. You can't overthink it.
The sky's the limit.
I know I'm on the right path.
I don't know where it's going to take me at the end.
Nothing is ever going to go precisely how you plan it.
A lot of times limitations create the opportunity to make something different.
Coming from a run and gun background or guerrilla style of shooting, I was taught to just roll with the punches and take what you can. As I venture into the more articulated side of storytelling and narrative work, I've realized that you only have two options: to either show up to the fight empty-handed or train your best for it. In many ways, your best line of defense in creating a story that will stick is your pre-production. For example, this frame I'm in right now. Would my points be as effective if I turned off this light? Would I feel as confident and comfortable speaking on this topic if I didn't have a teleprompter in front of me? Maybe. But the fact that I've put these efforts in prior to me even switching this camera on is a prime example of why pre-production is important to delivering an articulated message. We know that we wanted a retro film look out of this music video. The question was, how do we create that? Well, let's just look back at the 70s and 80s, the era we're trying to emulate. Films back then were not overly sharp nor full frame, so we didn't want to use a camera that was either of those things. For the past 2 years, I've used the Canon R5's 8K 12-bit RAW codec throughout my creative work. As beneficial as it is, the overly digital image it produces wouldn't necessarily have been useful for this project. Thus, we ended up using the Blackmagic 6K, as it produces an overall filmier and less digital look straight out of camera. When it came to lenses, we could have used the Rokinon primes, Canon EFL glass, or Sigma primes, but we chose these Canon FD lenses. At almost 50 years old, they hold up very well in terms of sharpness, while also processing highlights, lens flares, and skin tones similar to the unique characteristics films held back then. So making the decision to use those lenses got us one step closer to the desired look. In my final example, and probably most important, is the principal photography aspect of film. If you don't know what this is, it is essentially the period of time when all recording takes place. With that being said, the elements that contribute and funnel into principal photography are the set design, the wardrobe, and the lighting. And all of these elements were things that we put generous thought into. Whether that was Larry working on the wardrobe, Joshua specifying which light modifiers to use, or Nick bringing his vintage fleet, they all mattered in their own way to sort of lead into creating this bigger piece of art. I bring focus to this because I wasn't traditionally trained in the art of cinema. I never went to film school. I've never been on a Hollywood film set. Hell, sometimes I barely know how to use my camera. I learned everything I know from my peers and videos like these on YouTube. It took me a long time until I was able to come to the realization that there's always a way to create something you desire. You just have to keep going and bring that intentionality. Because making art is a process, and if you funnel fitting ideas and resources into it, you can really make a desired effect on the people who experience what you've created. So with all of that being said, I wanted to talk about how all of those ideas funnel into my color grading thought process, when I want to replicate the director's vision and take it one step further to something molded. So let's jump into DaVinci Resolve here, and I'll show you what I mean. My goal with this project was to emulate a film look, but any good color grade starts from a good base image. So obviously I could go in here and start fiddling away at the look of my image, but since I've started color grading, I've learned again and again how important it is to create a framework for yourself. So in essence, the first way we can do that is color management. Now, this is really just a blanket term of the process to replicate what the DP and director saw on set And there's many methods that you can utilize within Resolve or other NLEs to do this. However, I'm going to show you two methods to help you visualize what this means. So right here on the node graph, we have a clear in point, a node that rests in between, and a clear out point. And as you can see here, it's in a raw or log format. The modern cameras and displays that we have now really have no way of possibly transcribing all of the information that the camera captured. So the camera shoots out this log or raw format, and sometimes maybe even it will have these colors baked in. However, as the camera shoots out this format, it makes it digestible for your computer and display, which is what we see now. Now, when it comes to the actual color grade, our first task as colorist or editor is to transcribe what our production team saw on set. So the first way, and the way that I learned we can do this, is by creating a sandwich. So go over to your effects tab. You go ahead to the search bar, and we're looking for a color space transform. So we want to drag that on our first node. Secondly, I want to create another node by pressing Option S or Alt S. And I'm going to drop the same effect in there. This was shot in Sony S-Log3 and S-Gamut3.Cine. I'm going to input that information in here, just like this, into our input color space. And then we're going to get this image that kind of shoots out. We want to work in a different color space. So we're going to use DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate. And you'll see on screen here, some of the information is actually came back. Basically, it means that we can work with inside the sandwich that we're creating between the two color space transforms and manipulate the colors more naturally. So we can go over to our second color space transform, and we're going to input DaVinci again, and it's going to shoot back that S-Log3 image. We want to output this to what the monitor is capable of seeing. So what we can do from here is go to Rec 709, Gamma 2.4. And now, most monitors and most displays, they use this color profile as a way to kind of process the information that we feed into it. To explain this even further, we're taking the video's raw input, converting it into DaVinci's color space and gamma, and then converting that information to what our display can see and recognize. From here, you might go in between the sandwich and start dialing in your grade or your toppings. I feel like the exposure is sitting in the right place, so let me just go ahead and bring that contrast back. And you know, we can work like this. However, there is another method that I want to show you, which, in my opinion, I prefer. Method number 2 can be taken as slightly more complex. It's more of a broad change across the board. We can just clear what we have here by deleting these nodes, and we're gonna actually go over to our project settings cog at the bottom right here. Once we're in here, we'll notice that we're on the color management page, and it kind of already has its own settings dialed in. However, I want to do something different here, but essentially the same as the first. For color science, we're going to select DaVinci YRGB Color Managed right here. And then I'm going to uncheck Automatic Color Management. And then in my color processing mode, I'm going to scroll down until it says Custom. From here, this is where we're kind of seeing some of those same elements from before. So the majority of this project was shot on the Blackmagic. So I'm just going to go in here and select Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5. So once I'm here, I'm going to select the timeline color space. And as before, we're going to be working in DaVinci Wide Gamut and its intermediate space. So we'll just select that. And then again, with our output color space, what we can select is Rec 709, Gamma 2.4. Now, I'm still on this Sony clip, and you might wonder, wait, this Sony wasn't shot in this color space. Why would I want to do this method over the other? Well, simply put, we want to create a universal change in our project that hits on the majority, not the minority of clips. However, in instances like this, where we have a multicam project, I can do this to resolve that issue. So we're going to right click on the clip, and you'll see at the very top here, it says Blackmagic Design Film Gen 5. No, this wasn't what we shot it on, but this is what the project is telling it is. However, we can just go ahead and override that. We're going to scroll down to where we get down to S-Gamut3.Cine and Sony S-Log3. Now, these are two very similar methods that get you to the same destination, but as with everything you do in filmmaking, time is of the essence. So choose whichever method you can do more efficiently, but at the same time, don't compromise the integrity of your image by not working in a color managed workflow. Now that we've established our framework and brought the image to what the production team saw, our next step from here can be described as a methodology. The methodology came at somewhat of a light bulb moment for me. Traditionally, I've been taught to just go in here and make chili. Traditionally, I've been taught to just go in here and make changes willy-nilly. And as far as that goes, you can do that. But going back to this light bulb moment I had, I started off color grading in a very fiddly manner. Working on this project made me want to push the boundaries of what I was capable of. I kind of just dove down the rabbit hole trying to find a way to approach things differently. And I stumbled upon Cullen Kelly, a fellow colorist. In the past 2 months of researching, his teachings have really helped me transform the way I thought about color grading. And I find this interesting because, we as artists are always kind of looking for that aha moment where we suddenly feel like, okay, this is really the next step to kind of develop or hone our skills. And in my experience, sometimes it just doesn't come until we start searching outside of ourselves. I feel like the most important thing is about creating a pipeline. Of course, we can approach this on an image by image basis by trying to create what we want freely, but it can oftentimes lead to inconsistencies across the project. So, in a sense, I try to approach these things in a more systematic and repeatable way. This all starts by the way you formulate your node tree. I'm going to start by creating 4 nodes here, and I'll go ahead and label them noise reduction, exposure, contrast, and balance. Let's reestablish our core idea here. It's to recreate an 80s film look. So we could say, okay, what does that look like? Well, let's think about film back then. Nothing's blown out. They have softer highlights and no clipped blacks. Once we've kind of established this node tree, I'm gonna go ahead and grab a still directly from here so that we have a reusable template of this base structure. Open the gallery tab, and you'll see here we have a stills library. So we can just right click on this clip and press grab still. Let's say we just deleted these for now. Boom. I have exactly what I started with. So the first change that I'm gonna kind of make is the exposure. One thing that we can do to kind of manipulate exposure in a color managed workspace is utilizing the offset wheel. While we're in our primaries and color wheels tab, I can just bring up the offset, and I want this to kind of bring out some more of those bushes right there. Since we shot this in Blackmagic RAW, we don't have to use the offset wheel. Directly inside DaVinci, they have camera raw tools. So we can select clip here. And as you can see, now we have access to a lot of color information and the exposure and the tint and even the ISO. Oftentimes when I'm using Blackmagic RAW, I'll just click on highlight recovery just to be safe. From here, I'll just set my exposure. Again, I wanted to bring out those shadows, and I'm kind of disregarding any noise it's creating. I'll kind of just go to right here where I feel like the image is right there. I think my exposure is kind of sitting right where I want it to. We're gonna go to the next clip, reset it, and we're gonna do the same here. We're gonna bring up the exposure, bring up some of those shadows, kind of try to bring out some more information, and I feel like that's a good spot. So once I got my exposure set, I can start adding in contrast, and there's 2 pretty simple ways of doing this. I can either use lift and gain, and then that could be acceptable, or if I reset that, I can use contrast and pivot. Now, either of these ways work, just choose which one works best for you. And again, we're gonna kind of repeat this process across the board on all of the images. And this is the balance node. This I see as an opportunity because it gives us space to figure out, okay, where can we start adding in more color separation? I'm just gonna try to balance out some of those lights and bring that towards white. Now, you'll notice that I've saved noise reduction until last. Due to the way noise reduction works and really how it can introduce artifacting and overall soften the image, I try to be as minimal here as possible. But if I were gonna do it, it would look like something like this. I feel like right here, there's a good amount of color noise on the skin. Go to our noise reduction. I wanna sample 4 frames, and I'm gonna change the motion estimation type to better. The motion range in this video is actually it's in between small and medium. There's not a lot of things going on here, but they're kind of moving around a lot. So I'm gonna select medium. And I'm actually gonna untether this. I'm just gonna drive in some more of this chroma right there and a little bit of this luma. And if I were to turn it on and off, it's kind of made a uniform change. I'm gonna kind of blend this in just a bit more. And I don't wanna make really big changes here because it's just going to soften the image and start adding artifacts. I feel like this is a good spot. So you don't necessarily have to do this for every clip. I'm only doing this because I wanted to bring more detail out of their face later on. Now, this is a really great starting point to take what the team intended and mold it into something a little bit more. Using Option or Alt P, I'm gonna create a parallel node, and I'm gonna deselect that from our node here. Bring it to node 1, which is the noise reduction. Essentially what this is doing is dividing our node tree so we're getting the base input of our image twice. What this allows us to do, in effect, is have 2 equal branches that file into our final signal here at the end. It's beneficial to have this separate branch so that we can manipulate colors, shape the light, and also have that file equally into the adjustments we made previously within our exposure, contrast, and balance. So let's just start out with these 3 nodes. My first node, I'm gonna name color. My second, I'm gonna name adjustment. And the third, I'm gonna name LMT for limit. If I wanted to make adjustments to the colors on screen, this is a good place to start. So let's say I kind of wanted to bring this car to be more saturated. So I can go ahead and select the car, and in my curves, hue versus sat tab, I can just bring that up just ever so slightly. Let's say you push that too much and it's kind of bleeding into your shadows. So if we wanted to desaturate our shadows, I'd go in here in my adjustment tab and just select the blacks, which is here, back, and then bring that down. So we kind of just want to play it by ear, just leave that there. And then for my last node, I call this the LMT, or limit. So I can go into my LUT and LMT neon suppression. Now, the reason I use this node is because anytime that I'm making any major color adjustments, oftentimes it can introduce neon artifacts or out of gamut material. So I kind of just throw this on here as a little bit of a band-aid to kind of dial some of those things back. It's not a one size fits all sort of solution, but oftentimes it works for kind of bringing it back just a little bit. I put that in there. You're not really gonna see the biggest amount of change, but I keep that in there. Now at this point, we've passed the threshold of color correction and getting the image to look presentable to the client. I could send this to them and call it a day, but sometimes people aren't coming to us to make their image look like what they saw. They want us to express our creativity, and they've obviously put enough trust into us to make the creative choices. With that being said, everything after this point, you really have free reign if the clients approve of the base image. I'll just go ahead and edit this how I intended. Before we do any of that, I think it's important to, again, grab a still so we can share a few options with the client. Again, I'm just gonna open my gallery back up, go to my stills, and grab one. So now that we're in here, I'm actually gonna go ahead and reset all of these color values I had because I wanted to do something a little bit different. And I'm gonna scroll forward. I don't necessarily want this color of magenta. I'm gonna select it like right there, and I'm just gonna pivot it till somewhere I really like. And I love this gold color. Next thing I'm gonna do, select it again. I'm gonna saturate it just a bit. I like that. I really like how the image sits. It's kind of got like this green oranges hue, but when this orange is introduced, there's not a lot of color separation here. So what I'm actually gonna do is kind of drive some more cyan and blue into the shadows, but this time around, I'm gonna kind of fiddle with the range here to make it affect more of the image. I think that's a good spot, and from there I can kind of just adjust those shadows just a bit. And mid-tone wise, I feel like I don't want to affect too much, but I see how blue is kind of popping out now, so kind of want to balance that just a little bit. And then in the highlights, I want to kind of, I'm looking in this area specifically, but I kind of want to make them a little bit warmer. I think that looks good. As you'll notice here, some of these shadows are actually kind of looking a bit saturated, and that's not exactly what I want. So again, I'm going to go back to my curves tab, and in my luminance versus sat, I'm going to select the blacks again. And this time I'm going to drive back some of the saturation to kind of clean up what we added in here. If I go too far, now it's going to start affecting the car. I'm going to select the car, and it's happening right about there. I kind of want to bring that up. I don't want to affect those reds, so I'm just going to bring that out And I feel like that's a good spot. So I actually wanted to affect the saturation on this car. Felt like it could just pop just a bit more. So I'm gonna bring that up right about there. I like how this is creating a little bit of separation with those added blues. And once I'm here, I'll notice there's kind of this purple going on here, but it feels a little flat. It's kind of displaying as this bluish purple here. Bring the saturation out on this just a bit. And same here. I'm gonna go ahead and zoom in and make sure we're not making any huge changes and adding artifacts. And I think I like where that's sitting, so I'm gonna leave that as is. Another way that we can, I guess, sculpt the image further is using windows. Now, these are very situational. There's no one-size-fits-all method to doing this, so just kind of do this at your own discretion. In this instance, I kind of wanted to bring more focus towards the center of the frame. What I can do after my limit here is go ahead and add in two different nodes. In my window tab right here, I'm gonna create a gradient. And if I press Shift H, it's gonna show me part of the image where it's affecting. So I only wanna affect up here and kind of gradient this out just a bit. So I'll bring that up even more and just bring that down a little bit more. I don't want to affect this character sitting in the back. As you can see here, when the car comes in, I kind of want to start bringing more of that focus into the center. Again, we can just go back to our primaries and use the offset. So I don't want to affect too much because it's going to kind of look weird if just there's this black spot here. So I want to be very, very subtle about what I do here, but kind of bring it down enough to where it brings some more focus into the image. And then again, we're gonna do the same thing right here. We'll go back to the windows and we'll create another gradient, press Shift H. And this time around, I feel like we're gonna affect the ground here. So we can just go down here. And I think that's a good spot to be affecting. Again, I don't necessarily like this gradient, so I'm gonna kind of bring this down just a bit. And again, this is kind of bringing more focus down and towards the center, which is what our goal is. Now that we've kind of sandwiched these two together, if we go ahead and turn them both off, you can see it's kind of bringing a little bit more focus towards this bright car here. And if we scroll forward, it's kind of taking some of the brightness away from the bottom of the car, which is also good here when it passes the highlights. So I like this. And I think this is good to just keep moving forward. Once I've got that, here's where I get to add the cherry on top and really start diving into the compositing of our film look. There are about 5 texture and light-based characteristics of film: halation, grain, dust, blur, and soft highlights, each with their own respective qualities. Anytime I'm hoping to create some level of film emulation, I'm utilizing each of these to sell that look. So I'm gonna go over here to my parallel node after creating those windows, and I'm just gonna press Option or Alt S. So in here, we're gonna call this one halation. So halation is a byproduct of light passing through the layers of physical film and characterized by a reddish glow that shines from the highlights down to the darker portions of the image. This effect can actually be found directly inside Resolve. I'm just gonna search for it, and again, I'll just drop it in on our node here. As you can see off the bat, it's already starting to add saturation, and sometimes to places that we don't necessarily want. So I'm gonna dial in these settings merely to taste. You don't have to be technical about this, but understanding the principle of how this happens on film will help you composite this in a more realistic manner. If we go over to the car here, boom, I like this frame. So if I turn this node on and off, we'll see it's actually kind of adding more saturation and kind of some fringing around the highlights. Now, if we wanted to isolate this, we can just press View Isolated Regions. I don't want it to affect this big portion of the image. I actually want it to affect more of the outline of the image. So if I unselect that, you'll notice it's not really having an effect now. If I go ahead and bring this back and view those isolated regions again, I feel like there's a good place. From here, I can kind of add some of that saturation back in there. There's a lot of different controls on here, but I always like to check fine-tune relative spread. And I always turn my green and my blue all the way down. I don't want any green or blue in my halation. If I kind of zoom in towards, let's say, right here, we're really going to start noticing the effect here. But this isn't necessarily how I want it. I can go ahead and, I guess, bring the spread back, and I feel like right there might be a good point. And then maybe bring that gamma down. I don't want it to pop as much. And then I can just bring the strength up. Again, readjust the gamma. And maybe bring some of the saturation up. And then here's where you can start to composite it just a little bit more. When you add a secondary glow, it kind of gives this more like floaty effect on it. So I kind of like to do this to kind of layer it a little bit more, and I'll just kind of allow it to like spread outside of that red glow. Even then, we're gonna view the glow alone. Sometimes this will help us make some adjustments to what details we're actually losing. So I kind of want it to reduce the highlights just a tad. If I were to scroll back here, turn it on and off, now it's having more of a minimal effect than it did when we first added it in. And I just like where it's sitting, so I think this is a good point to leave the halation node. Obviously, it kind of looks digital still. No matter how well you composite it, it's going to be a bit sharp. So one way we can combat this is by adding blur. I don't want to take too much away from the image. So I'm going to scroll to the sharpest point. I feel like right there is pretty sharp. And I'll go over to my key blur tab. Go too far and then bring it back. Right there is perfect. One thing to keep in mind here. If you're uploading this to a platform like YouTube, you're going to be dealing with a lot of compression. So I try to make it a rule of thumb of mine to really not overdo this. But once I've got that done, adding grain is going to help combat that loss of texture and will help bring that image together. So if I go to my effects tab and search out grain, I can go ahead and create another node and press film grain. So I like using the preset 35mm 400T. This will oftentimes kind of give a more natural result to the one that I'm trying to create. Again, these settings, just use to your best judgment. If you know exactly what kind of grain you want to put in there, this is your best place to integrate it. I'm going to kind of just go through here and kind of mess around with the settings as I see fit. So I feel like the grain could be just a little bit bigger, a little stronger, and I want to take some of that softness away and maybe change that texture back just a little bit and spread it out. So now I can bring that strength back and maybe soften it out just a bit and add a little saturation. What I'm going to do here to bring it back just a bit and then zoom out. And I feel like this is just kind of a good place to leave it at. Again, these settings are to taste. Just use your best judgment. This last one, and probably my favorite, is just dust. This is another small way for me to kind of accentuate the idea that this is being projected on a film stock. So what we can do is actually go to film damage, and directly inside, you're gonna start noticing that we don't want all of these effects. So we're gonna scroll up. We're gonna make all the numbers 0. So we don't want vignetting, and we don't want film blur or temperature shift. And we don't want scratches, but we want one piece of dirt, and we can just bring that dirt size. You see right there is creating one right piece of there. So I think that size is good. Figure what I want to do with that one. And I think I want to make those white. So this is just going to kind of add that dirt in there. It's going to be very, very small add, but you know, it does a lot. I think that's good for now, but I'm going to kind of bring some of this global blend back. And from there, I'd usually stop, but I like to add 2 more things in the mix to kind of just finalize my look. Notice how these highlights are kind of just popping out. I don't really want that. I want my lights to be soft. So I'm going to create another node, and I'm going to go over to my curves. And one thing I'm going to do is actually select these highlights. And as you can see here, it's right at the top. I'm going to click Edible Splines. I'm going to go ahead and select other highlights in here to see what I don't want to affect. So I'm going to bring this down and then bring that back. And what this will do, if I reselect that, is kind of take that strain away from those highlights. And so if I turn this on and off, it kind of flattens out some of the highlights, which I wanted. This is a really straightforward step. You don't have to do this, but we can create a vignette. And one of the main reasons why I create vignettes is because oftentimes when we're looking at older work shot on films, we're seeing that a lot. We're seeing that there's a lot more shadows and darkness around the edges because of the way the light actually hit the lens. What we can do to actually recreate that is by using a window. I'll just go ahead and stretch this window. So I want to make sure I'm always doing my vignette towards the aspect ratio so it kind of makes sense. I'll just bring this up a bit more and bring this down just a bit more. And if I were to go to Shift H, it's actually affecting the center of the image. I don't want that. So I'm actually going to reverse the mask, and now it's affecting these areas, which I do want it to affect. So if I were to turn off this window, now if I turned off the mask too, and I brought down the offset wheel, we're bringing some more focus towards the center of the frame. And with that, I think it's done. Now, obviously, there's so many ways we can approach color grading, filmmaking, and life in general. To me, this series was about learning something as an artist. From my perspective, I've come to learn that there's no right and wrong way to do anything when it comes to filmmaking. It all comes down to the intentionality of what you're doing and what you hope to achieve from it. If there's one thing I learned, it's that there are no limits. We have the creative freedom to do whatever we want as filmmakers. Because of that, I find joy in film. I find freedom through it as a medium. And most importantly, I find purpose through it. I hope this helps. This is Sam, signing off till next time.